So we're talking about why startup teams fail. So um, the idea here is I'm going to present some things to avoid, some anti-patterns, if you will, and we'll probably roll through it pretty quickly. But feel free to speak up in the middle. I don't mind interruptions if you have a question or you want some clarification. I'm happy to make it more interactive, and then we can kind of have a general discussion or Q&A at the end. And so hopefully you'll find this useful. And I I think my background is definitely in the digital space, but I think it's broadly applicable to um, really any new business. But I don't know. We'll see. Maybe it's not helpful at all. I don't know. You'll tell me. So without further ado, let's go through our 10 major reasons here. So the first one that I often see, and these are, just from my having worked with lots and lots of startups and founders over the years, one of the key challenges that people have sometimes is that there's not a clear vision or strategy for the product, and those two things go together. So the thing about a vision is that it's essentially a view of the future state of the world as it will be when you've become successful and you've changed the world in some way. So like something is different. People are able to do something they weren't able to do before. You've had a real impact. And it's important as you're building a business to have a pretty clear sense on what you want. What is the major kind of problem you're trying to solve? And then strategy is how you get there. And a lot of companies I have encountered over the years have something that they call a strategy that isn't really a strategy. So a strategy is not a list of all the things you want to do. It's not just a list of goals, but rather a strategy is um, a fairly simple and clear path to the vision. So, and it's really important to eliminate all the things that are not necessary. So a strategy can be really more about what you're not going to do. So we're only going to focus on this market segment and not that one. Or we're going to build this business here because that will lay the groundwork for us to then build the business we really want to build. Those kinds of sequential pieces. And so the strategy helps you stay focused on moving towards the vision. And so once you have a strategy in place, you can set goals accordingly and have the goals align with steps in the strategy, right? So I sometimes work with bigger companies, and I often tell them that if the newest employee can't readily articulate very simply what the company's strategy is, you don't have a strategy, right? Like it shouldn't be like a big 20 slide deck complicated thing. Like it should be fairly easy to articulate. As such, they're hard to come up with because simple stuff is actually harder to come up with than complicated stuff. So it does take effort to derive a strategy from your vision, and how you're going to get from your current state to your future state, right? So another big piece is that the metrics are off. Metrics can be non-existent. We're not measuring anything. We don't really know what we're doing. They can be, we're measuring everything and we're sort of overloaded with information. Or metrics are just sort of not very good or not the right ones for the stage that we're at. So I will often make sure that teams are setting goals appropriately, and that they're measuring the right things, right? So you generally want to use metrics that are appropriate to where you are in your stage of company growth and development. There are certain things that are really important for getting to product market fit. And there are things where they're more important to growth and scaling, and those aren't the same categories of metrics. And so it's really specific to where you are in your overall process, right? And we want to also think about leading versus lagging indicators, right? So like revenue, booked and put in the bank is a lagging indicator. Typically a sale happens and then for sure when you're looking at revenue, whereas there are leading indicators of customer behavior, people coming to your website, people downloading an app, people doing some sort of trial. Those are leading indicators, right? So it's important to understand what you're measuring and how it fits within the overall customer lifecycle. So here's a typical customer journey through your product, right? So this is where a customer would first approach from some sort of acquisition channel. Depending on your business, that could be a lot of different things. It could be a billboard on the highway. It could be an app in an ad in Facebook. It could be a newspaper article about you. Like there's lots of channels, right? Presumably you're spending money on acquiring customers in some way. And those customers are intrigued by the value proposition in the ad. And they come in and they hope that your solution will solve the problem that they have. And if it does, then they'll continue to use the product and they'll go around that retention loop, right? And if all goes well, it'll produce revenue. And when you're doing that so well that they're really delighted and super excited about your product or solution or service, they will start sending their friends and family and colleagues to come to you as well. And that's basically a free acquisition channel, right? But what I like to do is to break this down into a couple of stages. So there are really three main stages of growth that companies go through in the beginning. There's the empathy stage, which is really about are we solving a meaningful problem at all, right? Like, do people have this problem? Is there a market segment that has a problem and that has money to spend on solving it? And that's sort of the empathy phase. So when you're first getting started, usually you're going and talking to customers and trying to make sure that the problem actually exists and that it's in a sizable, reachable market that makes it worth building a business around. Once you nail that, you can move into the stickiness phase, which is the thing that we're doing to solve the problem, does it actually work? Are people satisfied with it? Does it provide the value that we hope it does? And that's because that's where you'll get retention from. So you can see as I'm going through these three concentric circles, or these three circles, we're shifting our attention. So where we might be focusing primarily on acquisition metrics in the very, very beginning, like can we get anyone at all to come look at this thing? Once we've got a consistent value proposition that's working to get people's attention, then we might move to focusing more on retention, right? So we got our acquisition working, but are people who are using the product coming back and using it again? Or do they go away and try something else? Or do they cancel their subscription or whatever the model is, right? And then finally, after all of that is working, we would move into the growth phase where we're really focused more on, referrals and affiliates and channel partners and all that kind of stuff. And the reason for that linearity is that if you start working on growth and you spend money on, a campaign to grow, but you haven't really nailed stickiness, it's like pouring water in a leaky bucket, right? Like people are just going to fall out the funnel. So you want to kind of shore it up in order before you move on to the next stage. So I like to put metrics in these categories. And so where you are in your business can help guide you to which metrics are really the most important ones for the stage that you're in, right? So this is another common one with small teams, small companies. Founders have a really hard time taking their hands off the wheel and letting someone else drive. I think as you grow, it's really important to learn how to let the people you're bringing onto your team do their job, right? So here's how I think about that. For all leadership, and no less so with startups. Yes, people are wearing many hats. There's lots of different jobs to do. You have to have a lot of coordination and collaboration. But for any leader, and a startup CEO in particular, delegation is really, really important. Like, we all have too much stuff to do. I'm sure you guys are busy and overwhelmed. The sooner you can find ways to delegate things to your team, that you yourself don't have to always be the one who's doing, it'll free up your time for more important strategic things, raising money, doing new big, partnerships and sales opportunities, or whatever it is you're out there doing. So delegation and succession planning are really important to start figuring out early on. And there's this principle from Dan Pink's work. I'm pulling this from the book Drive, which is a really great book about um, employee motivation and intrinsic motivation. And the idea is that people are in the kind of work that most of us are doing these days. It's mostly knowledge work or creative endeavors, or designing, building, engineering, writing, creating. It's less around just like making widgets on an assembly line. The more knowledge work stuff, people are motivated by these sort of three components: a sense of autonomy, a sense of mastery, meaning there is an opportunity for growing and learning new skills, and getting good at your craft, and a sense of purpose, which of course ties back to that vision and strategy at the beginning. So delegation and autonomy go together, right? Like, we want to bring people onto our teams who we can trust to execute to the vision. So our goals as founders is really about articulating a vision and a strategy, and giving people the resources and the constraints to go do their part of the job, and certainly have some kind of check-ins for accountability, but then generally get out of the way, right? And let that stuff go, so that you can move a higher level of abstraction up the chain and focus on more strategic stuff. So the sooner you can get out of the day-to-day work, the better. Another thing that happens a lot with startups is they get distracted, and the team's having a hard time focusing on one thing at a time. I see this a lot, particularly as companies achieve a modicum of success in the market and they start to really grow. There's a lot of discussion about, let's go capture this market segment, or let's build an adjacent product or service set that is totally different. And people are kind of getting dragged all over the place, and it's hard to coordinate. So I think focus is probably one of the big silent killers of young companies, is that there's a lot of distractions, and here are some of them. The one big client trap is one that I personally experienced a couple different times. I've seen a lot of other people see it, where to build a startup properly, you want to try to find a scalable and repeatable business model. And as you're doing that, and cash is tight, and you're stressed out, and you're running really fast, you have a client come along, or a customer come along, that's got deep pockets, like, oh, Google has said that they're interested in maybe like doing a partnership with us, And so, wow, that sounds really attractive because they've got so much money and it's going to solve all of our problems. But next thing you know, you're doing some one-off crazy jangled, custom thing for them that's taking you off of your main trajectory in building the platform that's going to be repeatable and scalable, right? So the one big customer is really tempting because it feels like a shot in the arm revenue boost when you need it, but it comes at a huge cost of attention. And so I've seen folks make that mistake a lot. It doesn't mean you should never do it, but it's more of a caution that if you're going to engage in working with a really big customer who's going to take up a lot of your time and resources, it has to really have a clear business outcome that's worth it relative to other ways that you could spend that time, right? Like, could you get further along by working with 10 smaller customers instead of this one big one? That might be a better kind of diversification of the customer portfolio. Also, I think that as you grow, it becomes challenging to keep a sense of alignment across the organization, especially as there are kind of multiple initiatives starting to pop up and people are starting to specialize a little bit. So it's worth investing early in your sort of management and leadership and culture structures to build in ways that people can stay aligned and be up to date on, are we still on strategy? Is everybody doing stuff that's kind of rowing the boat in the same direction? Um, as leaders, you're going to be spending a lot of time really cultivating that in your organization. And the last one here, the magpie syndrome. I mean, this is basically my in the wild observations of the CEO who runs in every week with a shiny new idea because they were talking to somebody on an airplane and they're like, wait, do we have crypto? Oh, we need a crypto solution. Why don't you get on that right away? Like, I mean, that's sort of a cheap shot example, but you get the point. So it's funny when it happens to other people, but we also have to watch that we're also not doing it, that we, you're allowed to continue to have new ideas and try new things, but be very conscious and intentional about how those new ideas might fit into the original strategy and vision. And if it implies that there's some kind of change in the strategy, that's okay, but be really intentional about it. Just, try to avoid that, like kind of running to the next shiny thing, because you think it's going to be a shortcut or something like that. Let's see, what number are we on? We're on 5. Okay. So low trust in the organization. This is really that sort of squishy human stuff that in order to have autonomous teams, in order to be able to delegate, we need to have trust. And so, this is one of those things where culture forms very quickly in an organization. It's not just for big organizations. So like as soon as you get like 2-3 people trying to do things in a group, they're all bringing their own personality types, their own emotional baggage, their own past histories, and their own sort of ways of working. And so it's really important to get ahead of defining what kind of culture you want to have in your organization relatively early, because as it gets bigger, it's harder, and the culture will form of its own accord if you don't guide it. And it's harder to unwire that stuff later, right? So I've been in organizations where, the culture is, for example, everyone's really nice to each other, but they're too polite and people can't actually give each other effective feedback because nobody wants to step on anybody's toes, right? Like, so that's actually a culture of low trust. Even though people aren't yelling at each other and it's not necessarily toxic, it's a low trust area because folks are afraid to give each other feedback and have those hard conversations. And so just because people are nice doesn't mean that it's actually effective. And so I would watch out for how the culture of your organization is forming as you're bringing on staff, as you're hiring people. I love this old quote from Peter Drucker that culture eats process for breakfast, which basically means you can have the best process in the world, but if people have sort of ingrained behaviors that they're going to do, that they're used to, because that's basically what culture is, that will totally supersede whatever your process is. Like, so we have to make sure that we have a culture of honesty and transparency and accountability so that people can trust each other to work well as a group. There will be conflicts. People will disagree about what the right next move is. You want to have systems in place for that, like what decisions can be delegated to the team, let them work it out. What decisions need to be escalated up to you. You can't, manage all the decisions because that's not delegating. And that conflict resolution stuff, it also requires trust, right? And delegation, of course, requires trust. So that's really important. This one is really just around the idea of adding more people to your organization. Um, it's a balancing act, right? Like you absolutely can't do everything yourself. You can't grow a company of just one person. Well, I'm a company of just one person, but still, not if you're like trying to get somewhere that's a little bit bigger, which I'm intentionally not trying to do right now. But you're going to bring people on. You can't delegate to nobody, right? So you got to hire. But I see a lot of companies that they're like bringing too many people in too quickly, and I think it's important to just keep in mind that each additional person that you add when you're relatively small has a, we're just talking about this in culture. That person's going to bring all of their own sort of chemistry and personality, and it'll affect everybody else. So you want to be really intentional about each new person that you bring on. Um, it's certainly true in software. I don't know that it's necessarily true in every org, but labor is often the biggest expense. Like we got all these people building product or delivering services, we got to pay them. So you want to try to keep those costs under control, and only hire when you just can't keep up with demand, right? Like when there's so much demand that like it's actually costing you money not to be able to fulfill that demand, then you hire somebody at the bottleneck where that's really keeping you back from growth that's right there and available. um, and it's generally true that folks have to wear many hats in the beginning. um, these are all sort of general rules. There's certainly exceptions, but I think that it's better to have folks that can be generalists and move across a couple different functions in an org in the beginning. So when you're hiring, I've often found in the digital world, you'll have things like I'm doing a startup or I'm advising a startup, and we've got a candidate who's only ever worked at IBM or HP or Google or something. You may be a damn good engineer, but if they don't have any experience what it's like working in a startup where you got to like jump from one thing to another, and you got to like kind of build your own tools and manage your own infrastructure and all that, that they're not necessarily going to be the right person for a startup because they're too highly specialized and they're too used to being supported by a big infrastructure of support people and IT help desk and all that stuff. You don't have any of that in a startup, right? Like you got to have people who are scrappy and can get things done. And then lastly, I think it's important to try to minimize bringing people on board who are not really part of the core competence. So that means that like anything that you can outsource, marketing, copywriters, like whatever's not core to like your value proposition, it's probably good to have that as an outside person for as long as you can until you grow to the point where you need to bring that in-house. But that's probably way down the line. So having a network of contractors or freelancers or service providers who can do all those sort of one-off tasks so that you can focus on your solution and getting it right. It's a good way to go. Tech debt is a big problem, and this is a concept originally from software development, but I think it's actually true in a lot of different industries. And generally, the idea is like, to get to product market fit, you often have to cut corners and build things not exactly the right way. Like if you were to craft every little thing as perfectly as you can, so it's done the right way from the beginning, that often takes too long to get a solution in front of a customer so that they can start using it and you can learn from them, right? And so we intentionally will take on what we call technical debt. It means like we've put something together that we know we're going to have to shore up or replace at some point in the future, but we've sort of borrowed against the future to get something done quickly. The problem is that stuff adds up. So we need to do that, but at the same time, it's like responsibly using a credit card, right? Like we're gonna borrow some money off our credit card, but we got to pay a little bit back every month or else our debt just gets out of control, right? So it's important to allocate time in your week with your team to have some capacity that's available to refine and pay back any technical debt that you took on in like the last version of your system, right? Don't leave it until it piles up and becomes a big smoking problem. Um, and of course, there's other forms of debt as well that like companies have reorganizations and like redefined roles and re review their vision and strategy and reset it and move people around, and that stuff happens as well. And so it's important to kind of refresh your view of the structure of the org and roles and responsibilities and how teams are organized and that sort of thing on a regular basis as well. Sometimes you will do this. There's another reason teams fail is they built the wrong thing. I think that there's a real tendency with most crafty technical people who want to start companies of over engineering their solution. Want to keep in mind that it's usually necessary to build things that don't scale first until you can really get a sense of delivering the value with something that is possibly manual, or there's a lot of behind the scenes manual work or whatever it is. And then get it working and get the value proposition, get that loop of, customers are attracted, they're going to try it out. It does deliver the value. Granted, it's costing us a lot to deliver that value. So now we're realizing that demand has gotten to a point where we need to start automating some of the stuff from behind the scenes. And then you find where's the biggest bottleneck, where are we really falling down, how can we we're not going to be able to grow unless we can have an automated solution right here. That's the place where you should invest in some proper engineering and automating that part. So you sort of do that iteratively, a piece at a time as you grow, right? You never want to engineer the perfect solution way in advance and hope that people are going to like it, right? Because there's just the risk is too high that you'll build the wrong thing. This is another one that's pretty classic, which is folks, I'll ask founders like, well, who's your customer segment? And they'll say things like, oh, we've narrowed it down to men and women in the United States between the ages of 18 and 65, and it's like, all right, well, could we go any narrower than that? Like, so the general idea is like, you can't sell to the world. Like your vision may include something that is ultimately for everyone. People will say like, well, what about the iPhone? Like, what if I want to build the next iPhone? That's for everybody. Yeah, maybe, but like, you're not there yet, right? Like, you're not Apple, you're not Steve Jobs. You may be at some point, but right now you need to focus on like one particular niche to get going, get your foot in the door, and really nail the pain points and value proposition for that niche market. So like, get a beachhead, get it going, make it very stable and grow from there. And then you can expand to adjacent niches. So when you expand, it might be the same solution for a new customer segment that has similar needs, or it may be, maybe there's something else we can build and sell to the same customer segment. There's different ways to expand, but you want to try a focus on as narrow possible customer segment and as narrow a pain point as possible, and really get that flywheel going as fast as you can before you go too broad, right? And then the final one is the biggest one of all that I see over and over and over again is you're not really talking to enough customers as early as you should be. I'm sure none of you have that problem, but this is more, for a general audience. Talking to customers regularly and early in the process is the most important thing. And I can't think of a startup or founder that I've worked with in the last 20 years who was doing this so much that I'm like, okay, you don't have to, like, you're talking to enough customers. That has never happened. There's always like, I'll say, okay, your job is to go out and find 20 people like your customer segment and do interviews with them and make sure that they have the problem. And they'll come back the next week and I'll say, hey, how'd it go? And they're like, yeah, we found like, 5 people at Starbucks. And like, it's not enough. There was a whole week. What were you doing? Like, oh, well, we were doing wireframes and prototyping what we want the product to look like. I'm like, I don't care. That's not what you were supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be talking to customers like relentlessly, like get inside their head, build empathy with them, understand their problems, be able to answer, predict their answer before they even say the answer. Like once you know what they're going to say, you've interviewed enough people that you can pretty much guess what they're going to say. All right, well, then you've interviewed enough customers for that phase and you can move on to the next phase of customer interviews, right? So it's really important to not only to do it a lot in the early stages with product market fit, but also just to build it into the company culture. Because a lot of startups will become successful and they'll start to grow, and then they fall out of the habit. They forget how to talk to customers. And then it's been a few years and their product is getting old and boring, and now customers want different things. And then suddenly they're having a hard time keeping up because they don't have it built into their process to make sure that you're talking to customers. So one way that I've seen it effective is we used to do a thing where we would basically have a weekly, customer interview demo slot, and we would constantly be, trawling the internet to sign people up that they're going to come and see whatever we had working that week, right? Like it was just like every week we've got like the customer demo and feedback hour, and we'd have walk-ins and we'd be like, all right, well, here are our latest features, like try to use it, let us see what you think, give us some feedback. But it just became this very mechanical process of making sure that the customer is always there and you're always getting input from them. So those are the 10 things. I'm happy to stop there and we can sort of talk about some of what you saw and what your concerns and fears and questions and all that from here.